June 4, 1942. The morning sun rises over the central Pacific, casting golden light across a deceptive calm. On the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi stands surrounded by staff officers reviewing intelligence reports. The mood is cautiously optimistic. Japanese naval aviation has dominated every engagement since Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Today they believe will be no different. The American base at Midway Atoll, a strategic speck of coral and sand 1,500 miles northwest of Honolulu, must be neutralized. What Nagumo and his commanders cannot know is that they are sailing into the most catastrophic naval defeat in Japanese history, a reversal so sudden and complete that it will occur in the span of 6 minutes. The road to Midway began months earlier, in the euphoric aftermath of Japan's stunning victories across the Pacific. Between December 1941 and May 1942, Japanese forces had seized the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and vast stretches of the western Pacific. The architect of Japan's carrier strategy, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, understood that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's in a prolonged war. His strategy was audacious: deliver such devastating blows that the United States would sue for a negotiated peace, leaving Japan's new empire intact. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been the opening gambit. Yamamoto sought to eliminate America's remaining carrier strength by luring it into a trap at Midway. The Japanese plan was characteristically complex, involving multiple task forces and diversionary attacks on the Aleutian Islands to the north. Yamamoto's combined fleet was the most powerful naval armada assembled to that point in history: 11 battleships, 8 carriers, 23 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and over 300 aircraft. The Americans, by contrast, had only 3 operational carriers in the Pacific Enterprise: Hornet and the hastily repaired Yorktown, along with a handful of cruisers and destroyers. On paper, Japan's victory seemed assured, but the Americans possessed an invisible advantage that would prove decisive: intelligence. Since spring of 1942, U.S. Navy cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been breaking Japanese naval codes. By late May, Rochefort's team had determined that a major operation codenamed AF was imminent. Through an ingenious ruse, having Midway send an uncoded message reporting freshwater problems, they confirmed AF was indeed Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, now knew where and when the Japanese would strike. This intelligence breakthrough, meticulously documented in contemporary U.S. Navy records, transformed what should have been an ambush of American forces into a carefully prepared American counter-ambush. Nagumo's carriers striking force, comprising for fleet carriers Akagi, Tsukaga, Soryu, and Haryu, escorted by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 12 destroyers, approached Midway from the northwest in the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th. At 4:30 in the morning, the first wave of 108 aircraft launched from the carrier decks, bound for Midway's installations. The strikes would commence within the hour. On Midway itself, radar operators detected the incoming raid at 5:30. Marine fighters scrambled to intercept, while torpedo bombers and dive bombers hurried to launch before the Japanese arrived. The island's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire as the first Japanese aircraft appeared overhead at 6:30. The initial attack was effective, but incomplete. Midway's airfield and installations were heavily damaged, but the runways remained operational. More critically, American aircraft had escaped before the strike arrived. Returning Japanese pilots reported to Nagumo that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize Midway completely. At 7:15, Nagumo made his first fateful decision. He ordered the reserve aircraft aboard his carriers, armed with torpedoes for attacking ships, to be rearmed with bombs for a second land strike. On the hangar decks below, ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching weapons. The decision to rearm represented a calculated risk based on incomplete information. Nagumo had received no reports of American carriers in the area. Japanese reconnaissance that morning had been inadequate, or cruiser-launched float plane had experienced catapult problems, delaying its search of the critical northeastern sector by 30 minutes. This seemingly minor mechanical failure would have catastrophic consequences. At 7:28, while Japanese ordnance crews were removing torpedoes and stacking them on hangar decks alongside aviation fuel hoses and armed bombs, the delayed scout aircraft finally radioed a shattering message: 10 ships, apparently enemy sighted. The composition was unclear. Were carriers present? Nagumo's staff fell into confusion. The admiral halted the rearming operation, then reversed himself. Minutes passed in agonizing uncertainty. At 7:45, another message arrived. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo ordered rearming to continue. But at 8:09, the scout pilot corrected his report. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The revelation hit the Akagi's bridge like a physical blow. Everything had changed. American carriers, the very targets Yamamoto sought to destroy, were present, and Nagumo's reserve aircraft were being fitted with the wrong weapons. A more cautious commander might have immediately launched whatever aircraft were ready, even with land attack bombs. But Nagumo faced multiple pressures. His first strike wave was returning, low on fuel, and requiring immediate recovery. The American carrier's exact position remained unclear. The scouts' reports were frustratingly vague. Moreover, Japanese doctrine emphasized coordinated strikes with proper fighter escort, not piecemeal attacks. Nagumo made his second fateful decision. He would recover his first wave, rearm all aircraft with torpedoes, and launch a properly organized strike against the American carriers. It was doctrinally sound, but fatally time-consuming. Between 8:30 and 9 o'clock, Nagumo's carriers turned into the wind to recover aircraft. The flight decks became scenes of controlled chaos as returning bombers and fighters landed, refueled, and were struck below to the hangar decks. Below decks, ordnance crews worked frantically to rearm aircraft with torpedoes again. The hangar decks of all 4 carriers were crowded with aircraft, armed bombs stacked carelessly aside, fuel lines snaking across the deck plates, and torpedoes being manhandled into position. Every safety protocol was being violated in the race against time. By 10:20, the rearming was finally complete. Como ordered his carriers to turn into the wind for launch at 10:30. Meanwhile, American forces were converging on the Japanese fleet. From Midway, successive waves of Marine and Navy aircraft had attacked throughout the morning obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters. Lumbering TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, slow SBD Dauntless dive bombers, even for Army Beat 16 medium bombers, all attacked bravely, all were slaughtered. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore them apart. Not a single hit was scored. By 10 o'clock, Nagumo's staff had every reason to feel confident. They had repulsed every American attack without damage. The enemy's air power seemed spent. Once their own strike launched, victory would be complete. But the Americans' most dangerous weapons had not yet struck. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet from the cruiser Northampton, had launched his carrier strike groups early, gambling on intercept courses calculated from Rochefort's intelligence. The American formations became separated during the flight to the target. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Japanese carriers first at 19 centered. All 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers attacked without fighter escort into a storm of anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zeros. According to historian Gordon Prange in Miracle at Midway, the squadron was annihilated in minutes only. Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life vest to witness what followed. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked, next with similar results. 10 of 14 aircraft shot down. No hits. The Americans seemed to be repeating their morning's futility. Japanese combat air patrol fighters, drawn down to wave-top height pursuing torpedo bombers, felt victorious. On the carrier decks, the first aircraft of the strike force were moving into launch position. Success was minutes away. At precisely 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber squadrons, spotted a wake on the ocean below. A Japanese destroyer, having dropped behind to depth charge a suspected submarine, was racing northeast to rejoin the formation. McCluskey made an instantaneous decision: follow the destroyer. Within minutes, he saw them 4 aircraft carriers in a rough box formation, turning into the wind, their decks crowded with aircraft beginning to launch. The carriers were completely vulnerable, their combat air patrol drawn down to sea level by the torpedo attacks, their decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, their crews focused on launch operations. McCluskey's 2 squadrons 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers split to attack. Tent 24, McCluskey pushed over into his dive from 14,000 feet, targeting Kaga. The ungainly dive bombers, had seemed so obsolete compared to sleek Zeros, now became instruments of precision destruction. Training, courage, and catastrophic timing converged. Within seconds, Yorktown's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived independently and began their dives on Soryu. The Japanese, so supremely confident minutes earlier, watched helplessly as death plummeted from the sky. At 10:25, the first 1,000-pound bomb struck Kaga amidships, penetrating to the hangar deck, where it detonated among armed and fueled aircraft. A second bomb hit near the bridge. A third struck aft. Chain reaction explosions erupted across the ship as aviation fuel ignited, bombs cooked off, and torpedo warheads exploded. Within seconds, Kaga transformed from a floating airfield into an inferno. Smoke and flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. The carrier's captain, Okada Jisaku, was killed instantly on the bridge. Back below's decks, damage control parties found themselves trapped in compartments filling with smoke and fire. Simultaneously, bombs were raining down on Akagi and Soryu. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, took a bomb hit near the midship aircraft elevator. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck and exploded amid the rearmed strike force. The resulting explosion blew the elevator platform into the air like a leaf. Secondary explosions followed immediately as the ship's ordnance and fuel stores ignited. On the bridge, Nagumo and his staff were thrown to the deck by the blast. Fire and smoke engulfed the ship's center. Within minutes, Akagi was burning out of control. Soryu suffered 3 bomb hits in rapid succession. One struck the flight deck forward to hit amidships. All 3 penetrated to the hangar deck, where they detonated among armed aircraft. Like her sisters, Soryu erupted in flames. Captain Yanagimoto Ryusaku, standing on the bridge, watched his ship die around him. Explosions rippled through the vessel. The carrier's aviation fuel system ruptured, feeding the growing inferno. Firefighting efforts proved futile. The damage was too extensive, too sudden. By 10:30, 6 minutes after the first bomb hit, 3 of the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest carriers were flaming wrecks, dead in the water, consumed by uncontrollable fires. The strike aircraft that had been moments from launching now fed the flames that were killing their mother ships. The pilots who had dominated the Pacific for 6 months stood on deck watching their aircraft burn, helpless to intervene. The carefully orchestrated Japanese plan had disintegrated. Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the dying Akagi, could barely comprehend the catastrophe. Minutes earlier, victory had been certain. Now, 3/4 of his carrier force was destroyed. Only Hiryu, positioned farther north, escaped the initial attack. Captain Yamaguchi Tamone immediately launched a counterstrike of 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters against the American carriers. At noon, his aircraft found and badly damaged Yorktown, hitting her with 3 bombs. Japanese crews allowed themselves hope. Perhaps one American carrier sunk could salvage something from disaster. But Hiru's triumph would be brief. American dive bombers were already hunting her. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, aircraft from Enterprise found Hiru and replicated the morning's devastation, planting 4 bombs into her deck. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning, sinking, or abandoned. The combined fleet's margin of victory had become a margin of total defeat. As night fell on June 4, 1942, the full scope of Japan's disaster became apparent. 3 carriers, Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi, had already sunk, or were sinking. Hiryu, her hull torn by explosions and fires, would be scuttled by her own destroyers in the early hours of June 5th. With them went over 300 aircraft and, more critically, the cream of Japan's naval aviation experienced pilots, skilled mechanics, and trained deck crews, whose expertise represented years of training that could never be quickly replaced. Captain Yanagimoto of Soryu and Admiral Yamaguchi of Hiryu both chose to go down with their ships, following the samurai tradition that failure demanded death. Hundreds of sailors drowned in flooded compartments or burned alive in the infernos consuming their ships. Destroyers rescued survivors throughout the night, pulling oil-covered men from shark-infested waters. Approximately 3,000 Japanese sailors died. The Americans lost 307 men. 1 carrier, Yorktown, which survived the battle but was sunk by a Japanese submarine on June 7th, and 147 aircraft. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the operation from the super battleship Yamato, 300 miles to the west, received the catastrophic reports with stoic calm. He briefly considered bringing his battleships forward for a night surface engagement. But reconnaissance confirmed that the American carriers had withdrawn eastward beyond reach. On the morning of June 5th, Yamamoto canceled the operation and ordered a general withdrawal. The combined fleet, so mighty on paper, retreated, having accomplished nothing except its own devastation. As the surviving ships turned toward Japan, Yamamoto's staff began the painful process of reporting the defeat to Tokyo. The Imperial General Headquarters, conditioned to 6 months of unbroken victory, struggled to process the news. Initially, the disaster was concealed from the Japanese public, reported only as a successful withdrawal after inflicting damage on American forces. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific was broken. Before Midway, Japan possessed 10 fleet carriers. After Midway, 6 remained, but 4 of those were smaller converted carriers with limited aircraft capacity. More critically, Japan's industrial base could not replace the losses quickly. New carriers took years to build. New pilots required years to train. The Americans, by contrast, had already begun mass production of Essex-class carriers, with 17 eventually commissioned. The balance of naval power in the Pacific had fundamentally shifted in 6 minutes of destruction on June 4th. Midway's impact extended beyond mere numbers. The battle shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility that had paralyzed Allied resistance for 6 months. It demonstrated that Japanese forces could be defeated, that their planning could fail, that their technology was not superior. For the Americans, Midway provided vindication of their intelligence efforts and confirmation that Japan could be beaten. Through superior strategy rather than superior numbers, Admiral Nimitz and the U.S. Pacific Fleet gained confidence to pursue offensive operations. Within 2 months, American forces would land on Guadalcanal, beginning the long, bloody island-hopping campaign toward Japan. For Japan's leadership, Midway represented a moment of reckoning they refused to acknowledge. Rather than reassessing their strategic position, Imperial General Headquarters doubled down on offensive operations. Dispersing forces across the Pacific in ultimately futile attempts to defend an overextended perimeter. The bureaucratic and cultural structure of the Japanese military made honest assessment nearly impossible. Officers who suggested retreating or consolidating positions were denounced as defeatist. The carrier pilots who survived Midway were scattered to other commands rather than concentrated to rebuild the carrier force. The institutional lessons that might have been learned were actively suppressed. The Emperor Hirohito himself was not fully informed of the disaster's scope until much later. This institutional dishonesty, this inability to confront failure directly, would characterize Japan's prosecution of the war for the next 3 years, leading to ever greater catastrophes. The human cost of command failure was borne by ordinary sailors and pilots who died because their leaders made poor decisions. Survivors of the 4 carriers, many badly burned or injured, returned to a Japan that officially denied the extent of the defeat. Some would fight again. Others were quietly retired to prevent them from discussing what had occurred. The families of the dead received notification that their sons or husbands had died heroically, without explanation of the disaster's scope. The Battle of Midway stands in history not merely as a military engagement, but as a profound case study in the fragility of human plans. The decisive role of intelligence, and the catastrophic consequences of command decisions made under uncertainty. The 6 minutes that destroyed 3 Japanese carriers from 10:24 to 10:30 on June 4, 1942, represent one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in military history. Historians continue debating the battle's nuances decades later, but certain conclusions are inescapable. American code-breaking won the battle before a shot was fired. Japanese operational security failures and inadequate reconnaissance created fatal blind spots, and Nagumo's hesitation during the critical morning hours placed his carriers in maximum vulnerability at the worst possible moment. Modern scholars, including naval historian John Keegan in The Price of Admiralty, have analyzed Nagumo's decisions with both criticism and sympathy. His choice to recover aircraft before launching a counterstrike was doctrinally correct, but situationally disastrous. A more aggressive commander might have launched immediately with whatever aircraft were ready, accepting the risk of uncoordinated attacks. Yet Nagumo was following Japanese naval doctrine, which emphasized properly coordinated strikes. His failure was not recklessness, but excessive caution, adherence to procedure when circumstances demanded improvisation. The cultural context matters. Japanese military culture prized meticulous planning and discouraged initiative from subordinates, creating rigid command structures that could not adapt quickly to unexpected developments. The Americans succeeded through a combination of superior intelligence, willingness to take risks, and extraordinary courage from pilots attacking an obsolete aircraft against overwhelming opposition. The torpedo squadrons that were slaughtered attacking Nagumo's carriers did not die in vain. They pulled Japanese fighters down to wave-top height, leaving the sky above clear for McCluskey's dive bombers. 32 torpedo bomber pilots died in these attacks. Their sacrifice created the conditions for victory. War's brutal mathematics transforms individual deaths into strategic advantage, a moral complexity that defies comfortable interpretation. For the Japanese people, Midway's true significance remained hidden throughout the war. The government's suppression of information about the defeat denied Japanese society the opportunity to demand accountability or strategic reassessment. When the war ended in August 1945, with Japan's surrender following atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the full story of Midway began emerging. Survivors published memoirs. American documents were translated. Historians from both nations collaborated to reconstruct events. The battle revealed itself as the war's turning point, the moment when Japan's offensive capability was broken and eventual defeat became inevitable, even if 3 more years of fighting would be required to achieve it. Contemporary analysis recognizes Midway as a warning about institutional hubris and the dangers of strategic overextension. Japan's military leadership committed to a war they could not win, refused to acknowledge setbacks, and sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives rather than accept defeat and negotiate. The battle illustrates how quickly fortune can reverse, how small decisions create enormous consequences, and how technological advantages, like code breaking, can overcome numerical superiority. Intelligence and information proved more valuable than battleships. Flexibility mattered more than doctrine. Courage mattered more than equipment. The physical site of the battle-empty Ocean 13, 100 miles northwest of Hawaii, bears no markers except the wrecks resting 3 miles below the surface. The 4 Japanese carriers lie scattered across the seabed, tombs for men who never escaped burning compartments. American and Japanese veterans in later years sometimes met at commemorations, finding common ground and shared experience of combat's horror. Former enemies acknowledged each other's courage while mourning the waste of young lives in a conflict that need never have occurred. Midway's lesson resonates across decades, that power can vanish in minutes, that supremacy is fragile, that the confident can be humbled by events they failed to anticipate. On a June morning in 1942, Japanese commanders believed they controlled the Pacific's destiny. 6 minutes later, their carriers were burning, and the course of the war was reversed. History turned on a knife's edge, balanced between intelligence and ignorance, preparation and surprise, courage and fate. The memory serves as permanent testimony to war's uncertainty and the human cost of strategic failure.